of the disabled and of the misfortunate. Reconfiguring hierarchical relationships as benefactor-beneficiary relationships, ones that are contextual, fluid, nurturing, sustaining, transferable, that change across the lifetime. Rosemont and Ames show us how, quote, through many and loving interactions with our own grandmother, we learn to interact appropriately with other grandmothers despite their uniqueness. The correlation of person and role helps us learn how to act with appropriateness and deference, two civic virtues that are best learned in the family context and that might stand as a beacon for a radically democratic homeschooling practice. So in that paper, certainly I'm interested in Dewey's continuity thesis. He certainly implies that nothing good will happen in schools unless it is somehow in continuity with what happens outside of schools. So that certainly includes the family, but that includes neighborhood life, that includes what children are doing in all of their various activities of life and the places those happen. So I think that continuity thesis is very clear in Dewey's early educational writing. It's clear that to some degree the school is meant to be an extension of the family. I think Dewey's later writing, he is unclear really about whether the family is the primary metaphor upon which we imagine democratic living, or whether or not it's friendship. And I think, of course, both are lovely metaphors. We think about what a truly cooperative, well-adjusted, harmonious society would look like. But ultimately, I want to argue that the family provides more power because of this notion of vulnerability, because of this notion of benevolence. That's really important to democratic living, where we are taken care of in our younger years, ideally, and come to take care of others. And that learning best happens in the family. So certainly that Confucian role ethics has helped me think through that problem. Really raised that issue for me in Dewey and what the ideal democratic society would ask of us and where it might be learned. So it's been very fruitful. So thank you for coming and here with a picture of Dewey with more of his colleagues and former students while he was in China. Hope you've learned something today and I have some questions or comments for me.
Thank you, Kyle. Very, very interesting talk and work that you're doing, and we definitely like to invite everyone to share questions or comments.
Yes, I have.
Yes, please, Vijay.
Hi.
In a very special time, now present, when I saw the topic, the title of the Democracy of Dead, I noticed your PPT, this one, That Dead, but the title of the seminar is the Democracy of Dead. So the first question just about the dead, because dead, this word, is so many different definitions. Yeah. So what's your own definition about dead? Why you choose this kind of title to share with us in the special time now? Halloween is coming. Yeah, and you noted the Confucius, and he has a very famous sentence. We even didn't know of living life, then how can we know the dead?
Yes.
Yeah. So the second question is coming too. How can we face the diversity of the definition of the dead? The dead, and now it's and impossible to integrate the different about the death. Somebody said, a death is just dead, nothing left. But others said, death is just a body lost, but his spirit still there. And others just said, even though you are newborn, you are just on the way to the calm. So the second question is about what the truth about the death, about the dead. The dead one just means the lost one, or passing by just means history, or any others. To me, the different definition, maybe it's not direct. This one is right, that one is wrong. It's a part of truth. But how can we treat with the different level about the definition?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I want to know your answer.
Yes.
And
what?
the last question.
Another one.
Right now.
Yes, because I'm prepared for this seminar. Because
Great.
your seminar to me is just a kind of things, synoptic things. The experience. Today you cut many sentences from John Dewey. In my opinion, many sentences full of his own experience about his own life, and of course my Chinese life during that time, more than maybe 100 years ago. So the experience is very special in the title of Death. To me, just this time is very special because 6 days ago, one of my teachers is passing by, and maybe the most important teacher in my life. And so, in the 3 days ago, just 3 days ago, I can do nothing because of his death. The only thing I can do, just tears after tears. And then I just drive to the natural center and working after working. And then 3 days later, now I'm here and so smiling. It's beautiful too? Yeah, a joke. I can smile to face his death because in the forest, on the top of the forest, something emerged out. The dead one and the living one, me living, but my teacher, dead. There must be something connect. So these connected things I can't express by words. So the democracy here, when I face another keyword, democracy here, to my teacher, he's a big fellow in China too. He's very famous. But I just wonder, when he faced his death, what kind of choice he can make by himself? What kind of choices by our society in China? Because in China, euthanasia is out of law, right? Other country maybe it's okay, and us, yeah, it's okay. So, so the third question, just this topic.
Yeah.
Democracy is a concept about a social concept, but that maybe not only social issue, but also private issue, but also spiritual issue, but also regional topic. It's very large scale.
Yeah.
So what's
Yes.
your frame? What
Yes.
frame?
Thank you for
Yeah.
all of your wonderful questions.
Yeah, great
and I'm very sorry to hear about the loss of your teacher.
Thank you.
So Where should I start? So I think, maybe to start with your teacher. You are still here. We are all still here, thanks to many people who went before us. And we are who we are because of our relations with those people. And those relations are not, in a certain sense, gone. I mean, they continue on in our experience. So it is, something special, about us as human beings, first of all, that we are the type of creatures that can establish continuity with our past, and even with our very deep past. Dewey, I think, was very fascinated with that, the plasticity of the human, that wasn't just one moment after another through empty time, but there is within time the ability to reach back into the past, so to speak, and integrate it into the present, to create consummatory experience. So we often think of aesthetic experience or consummatory experience as spatially located, I guess, of the living creature within the environment. But there's a temporal dimension to democracy that Dewey, and I think certainly pragmatic Confucianism, would want to point out, the integration of the past with the present, which we call tradition. Right? So there's both a private and very much a public aspect here. So for us as individuals, and again, I think, death, as you're talking about, it is public, it is private, it is spiritual. Dewey would, want us to think about those all as different aspects of the same phenomenon. It's integrated. The spiritual and the ideal is not somehow disconnected from our everyday concrete realities, but are those ends in view, those goals that we have that guide present conduct. And for them to have meaning, they must be in continuity with the past, with past experience. So, we've just to speak about democracy for a moment. I mean, we've seen the U.S. try to go to other countries and impose democracy. It makes no sense, and of course, it's a hopeless failure. So, Dewey as a traveler, I really respect reading his comments when he was in China, when he was in Mexico. He was not telling people, this is what democracy is, or this is what you should be doing. And for him, democracy was a way of life, everyday way of life, of being in relationship with others and the environment, the situation in which we live. Particular type of relationships that depend on open-heartedness, honesty, generosity, sincerity. These are the things that allow us to make those types of intelligent adjustments. So I think the question is always, what can we do with tradition, and what can we do with our own past? Many things we inherit from the past are beautiful within their time, but are not functional for us today. They become dysfunctional as the world is constantly changing. When a habit becomes dysfunctional, that's when intelligence kicks in for Dewey. And we attempt to find a way of harmonizing or adjusting. And the same is very much true for the individual for Dewey. We've all experienced, starting with our families, formative wounds, as well as moments of great care. And so the question is, what do we do with those things as well? What do we do with those? And that requires for a reconstruction as well. But it is a view of harmony, There's no getting away from the traumatic things that have happened to us as individuals, or the social trauma that we live in the present. The question is always one of integration for Dewey. So your question is beautiful, and it raised so many things. While not a Confucian scholar, I've certainly seen that quote from Confucius, what do I care or what do I know about the spirits? or what should we, we shouldn't worry about the realm of the spirits or the ancestors until we figured out how to live with each other in the present. And in some ways, I take that as read that through a Deweyan lens, that the best way to take care of the future is to take care of the present. To live fully in an adjustment in the present means it's our best guarantee that we are prepared for the future. And there's no other way around this. There's no bypassing it. So, a wonderful set of questions. I'm sure I did not answer all of them, but thank you. And just as you were talking, democracy of the dead or democracy of dead. I don't know if that was a grammatical mistake. One of those creative mistakes, maybe. I think it is a poetic rendering, but in English, we don't have a good word for. Maybe it's ancestors, I don't know. But the way in which the dead or the past continues to be relevant in the present. Democracy of the dead, yeah, the dead are gone or no longer here. I mean, this was Dewey's critique of school, that what it gave to children was a past disconnected from the present, a set of habits that were not in adjustment with present realities. So that's the true dead. The past that cannot be integrated into the present. So we don't want that. We want a living dead or a living past somehow to animate our present. So, wonderful question.
Kyle, this may be unfair, but I'll ask it anyway.
Sure.
And it may or may not be the sort of central focus of your inquiry, but I'm interested in the extent to which Dewey perceived similarities and differences in how our two societies construct notions of the self, and particularly as it relates to education. Does that make sense?
Yeah. We don't. I'm hoping for a lot more scholarship in the coming few years as conferences are kind of devoted to. What did China do for Dewey? I mean, we see his enthusiasms there, but we don't necessarily understand what the impact of his travels meant for his thought, or really, I don't know if you can trace those anyway, but certainly I just tried to suggest that this was a formative period in his life and that there was a lot of enthusiasm there. But certainly I think as I stated, individualism for Dewey always meant the individual within the group, the individual as an expression of the group, in continuity with the group. And I don't know if I could do much more than just repeat some of the things I said, that formal equality, or abstract rights-bearing individuals. I mean, it's like Dewey, that type of liberal democracy really means nothing to him. It is about the concrete situation in which actual rights are realized within a living community where I recognize your rights, you recognize mine. But an abstract human rights discourse he didn't see as very helpful. And so understanding the individual was always understanding the individual in time, in a concrete situation, as the expression of a group, but also as, again, an individualism that could be grounded, I think, in vulnerability as well as in capabilities. And again, what this means for education, I think, is you'll have to tell me what the motivation for your question, because I'd love to hear you speak on this, but...
that's another brown bear.
I'm sure you have a few words. Again, any education, any schooling that doesn't establish continuity with home life, with social life outside of the school, is not a schooling that the child will be able to make use of. And we see this, certainly see this in the debates happening, you know, as Dewey, Jane Addams engaged immigrant communities in Chicago? Like, you know, what would it mean to integrate that home life in a positive way into schooling? A mutual reconstruction, you know, is always like of American culture and of immigrant culture.
Well, one of the points that sort of prompts that kind of a question is the perceived differences among some of us with respect to the role of the group in the learning process and group learning. And so, at least at the adult level, it seems that a number of us perceive some resistance among students to group learning.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so pushed back,
Yeah.
depending upon the context. In China, the stereotype is that students are not necessarily oriented to learning through the group,
Right.
but directly from the authority of the teacher. Right? And the group plays much less of a role in the fostering of the knowledge that the learner comes to construct. And so that seems to me at least a little bit of the underlying of that are sort of interesting conceptions of the self and the self in relation to the other in the learning process. If that's making any sense.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful, beautiful, and very much more concrete than I was thinking. You know that this problem of group work in classrooms and schools around the world. But you know, for me at least, this is just an artifact of the way we've set up our institutions. You know, where grades and rewards are handed out to individuals, where assessment somehow imagines that it can isolate the individual from the group. We all know that our capabilities radically change depending on the concrete situation we find ourselves in. So any assessment or any learning is always situationally bound. I assume you and I would agree with that. I assume that's a Deweyan view, a Confucian view. And schools have just really got that wrong in a lot of ways. Yeah. I mean, I don't. Do you see something more inherent or culturally fundamental in the observation that, say in China, students might be oriented toward the authority of the instructor rather than to other social relationships that are present?
Well, my sense is that in very, very limited and in probably in all respects inaccurate, but they're sort of like we have this sort of recognition of the importance of the instructor, the authority in China, and what it is that individuals learn, yet China is known to be a communitarian kind of society. In the United States, we are far from regarded as a communitarian society, and we place considerable emphasis on individual achievement and recognition of the individual in terms of the achievement process. So there seem to be cultural differences there muddled in my head about how that gets played out in terms of structures of schooling and educational institutions in general.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's no doubt the dominant trends, like within the U.S., is toward kind of abstract liberal democracy, rights-bearing democracy, that vision of the individual, you know, and the pragmatists, Jane Addams, John Dewey, their whole life, you know, argue that we need a social ethic, and not an individual ethic. You know, the question is not, are you as an individual following a principle or a law? But the question is, are we as a society, and are you as an individual contributing to a society that creates more flourishing human conditions? So, you know, I've been reading Jane Addams this week for class, but very clear on the limits of this type of individualism.
Yeah.
It means nothing, you know, even when it's meant benevolently, you know, like people have to be invited into the conditions of their own freedom and their own education. So this calls for a social process. You know, that said, I don't know, the relationship of student to instructor is also a social relationship. Yeah, I think there is, our notion of what social learning entails and group learning is shot through with so many assumptions. It would take a long time, probably.
Yeah, another brown bag.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. But I'm sure we could do it if we had enough time to sit down and talk.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, please.
Dr. Greenwalt, I have two questions. The first one is in regards to your argument of home being a place for potential promoting educative and democratic leading. I was wondering, where do you envision that will happen in how? And what are roles that schools can play in that process? And the second question is, I assume that in your discipline, that a precepts teachers may have some question regarding, their set of home values. Although we advocate for, consistency of school and home, what if the core values are incompatible? Like, what are the roles of teachers? Like, how we as teachers respond to that? Should we? I don't want to use the word intervene, but to some extent we are intervening this core values passing down from the family tradition in our classrooms.
Can I add a footnote to that, because I have a similar point, was
Sure.
whether or not you make the argument that education or schooling that's incompatible with what happens in the family or broader society is ineffective or wrong. So does that preclude the activist or liberating role of education in correcting injustices that exist beyond the classroom, I guess?
What I want to add to that, I think what you are arguing for is consistency of life, not necessarily values. I think that's what you just said.
Yeah, I think so.
I think I'm extending that to what if.
Right.
So, I guess the argument, one argument that I'm making here is just pointing out to the importance of imagining, so for pragmatists, like democracy just means cooperative social living, right? It really just means everyday life. The more I can understand the way in which my values and my behaviors negatively impact others, and work to reconstruct my habits so that I'm not limiting the opportunities of others. Just in my everyday life, that requires inquiry. That requires thought, because I can't know, especially in a society as complex as ours in the 21st century, literally everything I do redounds with horrible environmental and social effects. The products I use created by child labor, and so it's an ongoing inquiry into figuring out how to deal with those. So that is the view of democracy here that we're dealing with. I think the question still for me, or the philosophical argument, is how do we imagine this cooperative society? And I think what struck me about the Confucian role ethic so much is just a notion of equality that can reconcile hierarchy. So that's been so important, and that's why I think the family itself is a place where we learn that hierarchy is not bad. Okay, if it means a beneficiary benefactor relationship, if it means honoring vulnerability of the human condition and of the human other. I can't imagine a place where that's not learned, any other place where that's learned by the family. So that's the kind of philosophical argument. The practical side of this, is that even when home life does not go well, so this is kind of a well-trodden argument, kind of against homeschooling, is that there's many dysfunctional families that couldn't homeschool their children. So, there are a couple of standard responses, I guess. One is just to point to the damage that public schools have done to people and to children. And so it's, we can't privilege the public space as somehow like a absolute corrective to what happens in families. I mean, I view these different public spaces in some ways. And would argue that, in terms of educative function, the family is our best model. And Dewey's very clear about that in the his early educational writing. The family is the type of society we're looking at, especially, he was a bit idealistic, but, the pre-industrial family, where the household was a site of production as well as a site of consumption, where families, where children actually needed to participate in the life of the household, the family was going to live. That was incredibly educative in a positive way. And people learned quickly the interdependence of roles, that we need each other, but that you can't expect the same thing from every member of the family. Grandma participates in family life in a different way, than dad. So, schools themselves, yeah, I think if we think about them as another space, like not the primary space, but just as a space, like I'm not against schooling, I think this is the argument in my book that I published a few years ago. It's just that homeschooling and public schooling can happily coexist. First of all, it requires public schools, though, to understand that most of a child's formative educational experiences are happening at home. And the only way that the school can really have a positive impact is to commit itself absolutely to working with that space in harmony. And there's no other choice. So you can't make assumptions about what children bring from families. You can only inquire into concrete family lives and work to build educated experiences out of those. And sometimes those will be corrective, you might say, or there's a readjustment that's needed. Again, we all carry traumatic experiences from our family life as well. You can avoid Freud here, like, every parent screws up their child in a unique way. And so part of growing up is like figuring out how to integrate that experience. Yeah, so I think it's, there's such a negative reaction to homeschooling, I think, for Americans, probably for most people. Gut level reaction, I certainly see that quite a bit. Rethinking what can happen in the home. I know I'm kind of talking on here, but I'll just say I think Dewey and a lot of reformers, once they saw that production was no longer happening in the home, once they saw both parents going out to work each day, assumed that the home had lost all educative potential. It was only a site of consumption. And I think that's wrong. I think anyone who has children knows that in everyday interactions, a lot of chances for learning can happen. Just because we're not making soap in the home anymore doesn't mean that children can't